There we go. Look at that. Wow. Who would have believed I could have done that? Well, here we are. Thank you for your help. It was a simple problem, but sometimes the simple problems are very difficult to solve. But at any rate, we solved it. So we are going to talk today about the national accounts and GDP and balance of payments. And let me get the other thing that I want to get up. There we go. I may want to get this up as well. Okay. Here we go. So let's get started. And did you send? You gave me but did you send that to me by email? Can you please? Yes, last week. Can you please? Yeah, can you please send it to me by email so that I can, because I can give you feedback. I can write. That's what I wanted for, so I can write in and make comments in the file. You've received my comments, so you know. Right. So that's what I do is I comment on the work. So here we are. We're going to continue the discussion. I think this is where we left off. I checked at the end of the, and I think this was basically where we let off. And I've talked about there's three main areas of what's called the balance of payments, and there's the net there's the net exports, current net exports, current account, and capital account. And so each one of these describe flows. Each one of these describe flows of goods and flows of goods. These are flows of goods. These are flows of investment. And these are flows of capital. So we're talking about flows. We're talking about net flows. So what we're trying to do here is to understand the flow of goods, investment, and capital in and out of countries, so that we can understand their position. By doing this, we can then get an understanding of their relation of their capital relationship. Capital and relationship. Goods, capital, investment, relationship with the rest of the world. So that's what we're interested in. We're interested in how countries interact with each other in the global economy. So that's what the purpose of the balance, and all of this adds up to the balance of payments. So the balance of payments tells us the net position of a country, and each one of these describes certain aspects of a country's economic relationship with the rest of the world. So that's what we're trying to do here, is to understand through each of these separate accounts. These are different accounts to understand the different pieces that make up the total economic relationship that a country has with the rest of the world. And that, in the end, is described by a single number. and that's called the balance of payments. And the balance of payments talks about the net flow. In the end, the net flow of capital in and out of a country. So that's what we're working for. And the last time we spent a lot of time talking about the net exports. And so I think that's basically where we were at the end of the last session. And if we, let me just go back very briefly. And you can see we had talked, I think we were at this position. At the end we were talking about Japan's net cap, that's the net that's net capital flow. But not the capital account, but the net capital, it's called net capital flow. And it talks about, it's the net exports. So the net exports for Japan in 2014 were negative. So what this was saying, in 2014, Japan ran a trade deficit, which means if you run a trade deficit, then what we also know is that you're a net borrower from the rest of the world. So that's the important thing to remember here, is that if you run a trade deficit, then your domestic savings, people are not saving enough compared to the investment that's being made in the country. And that's the very important relationship between net exports, and the connection that we get from the from the GDP identity. Okay. Now this takes time. This takes time to understand, but when you do understand it, these connections are very profound, very interesting. They're very important. That relationship between the trade that a country does and the balance of savings and investment that takes place within that country. And again, remember, net exports, so that's exports minus imports, are equal to savings minus investment. So savings minus investment. So Japan in 2014 had a negative the trade deficit was negative. So what that means is Japan's savings was less than the investment that took place, the business investment that took place within Japan in 2014. There was not enough savings. Now you would now traditionally, if you go back not so many years, this for more than 30 years was positive, and very positive. And one of the things that's happening is the society is aging. As the society is aging, the savings is insufficient because people are leaving the labor force, and they're instead of saving, they're now drawing down from their life savings. So the way that this is being reflected, that fact is being reflected here in that you have a negative net capital flow, a negative trade balance. So that negative trade balance, in fact, tells us something about the relationship between savings and investment within Japan. So that's the important thing to remember. And if you remember that, then once you remember that, then you'll start looking at a trade deficit differently. Trade deficit doesn't mean, oh, we're buying too much from another country. That in this case Japan is buying too much. Now it may mean that Japan isn't saving enough, or it may mean that it has a lot of investment needs and it needs to import capital. It may mean that it's consuming too much. That's also a possibility. But in this case, the likely explanation is that the society is aging. And as the society ages, people are not saving. People that are retiring are now drawing down on their savings. And since they're drawing down on their savings, they're not saving anymore. And yet that investment, the country still needs investment capital. It still needs, the businesses still need to make investment, but the investments aren't enough from domestic savings because of the aging of society. So that's very likely is very likely the proper way to interpret this figure. Okay? So keep that in mind as we go through each one of these accounts. As I mentioned the last time, the National System Accounts is a system of different accounts that describe different aspects basically different accounting aspects of a country's relationship with itself and with the rest of the world. Okay, so that's where we are, and now we're going to continue, and we're going to continue the discussion on the current account. So the current account takes into income payments received by domestic residents and firms from foreign entities, income payments made by domestic residents to and firms to foreign entities, current transfers received from foreign entities, and current transfers made to foreign entities. Okay, let me get up and I'll put all of those down, so that becomes, so you can think about what's going on there. This talks about, so the current account talks about, the first one is income payments received by domestic residents and firms from foreign entities. So you have a foreign entity. Okay, so that means that there is some business some activity, some entity located outside of Japan. That's outside of Japan. Ex-Japan, that means outside of Japan. And that's making payments. That's making payments to households and firms in Japan. So that's firms and households that are located within Japan that are receiving payments from a foreign entity. Now, how would they receive these payments? Well, in the past, what it means is that households and firms have made investments to acquire the right, they've acquired the legal right to receive payments from foreign entities. For example, Japanese companies have invested abroad. They've built production. They've built production plants in countries like the United States, automobile production plants, other manufacturing production plants in the United States, in Mexico, China, Indonesia, Malaysia, Europe, all over the world. So all of those, and so those entities are in profits. Those entities are in profits. And when those profits come into, when the people who hold the rights to that bring those profits into Japan, that's recorded. That's recorded in the current account. So that's where that's recorded. That has nothing to do with exports. And that's why it's different. It's different from exports. Current account is different. It has to do with investments that have been previously made. So another example, Sony owns a movie company in the U.S. So that makes movies. The profits that are received, that's recorded here. That's where that comes from. If you invest in a foreign country, in some foreign stocks, and you sell that and you receive payment from that is, I believe that's going to go here. If you receive dividends, that type of thing, that's going to be here. So households can also receive, individuals as well as firms can receive that. If a government owns a foreign entity, it's the same thing, and they receive payment, then that's also going to be here. So that's that kind of payment. Income payments made by domestic residents. It's income payments made by domestic residents and firms to foreign entities. So it's also the other way. If foreign entities own assets in Japan, if they've made investments in Japan, then those payments are made, then they're receiving those payments. So it goes both ways. This would be a positive, this would be a negative. So it's positive flows and negative flows based on the ownership of assets and the rights to the payment. So the legal right to the payment and the direction of the flow as a result of that. And also current transfers that are received from foreign entities. So current transfers and also current transfers are that's also and this is the part, current transfers. Because actually I get, sometimes this is still sometimes I get a little bit, current transfers also involves investment flows in both directions. So it's past investments and also current investments, the flows that are made. So keep that in mind. That's what we're talking about here, and so that it's expressed as this identity. The current account is the total is the current account net exports plus income payments from the rest of the world and income payments to the rest of the world. And those are current, and those break up into current income payments to the rest of the world, to the rest of the world, current transfers from the rest of the world, current transfers to the rest of the world, and the whole figure is that whole. All of this is the total identity of the current account. And as I show here, it's both net exports plus this. The total is what's called the current account. It's a little bit confusing, but that's how the terminology that's given for that. So that calculation, we can calculate that for 2013 and 2014. We have net exports. Then we have those payments. Those payments are that's 13 trillion yen of negative net exports. So then the current account, the payments from the rest of the world are 24.6 trillion yen. So that's a positive. That's 24 trillion yen that came into the country from investments and flows and current transfers and payments that are made. The current transfers would be if you sell an asset and bring that back in. That's what current transfers are. So 24 trillion yen is a lot. It's 5% of GDP. That's a lot of money. 24 trillion yen is real money. And so you're talking about that's about almost 5% of GDP. So that's serious. That means Japan has made some serious investments outside to be receiving that kind of payments. That means that the country in the past has made huge investments. And you can see the outflow is to the rest. That's from the rest of the world to the rest of the world is 7 trillion yen. So there's more investments that have been made outside from Japanese households and businesses outside of Japan than inside of Japan. You can see that right there. That's what that difference tells you. So there's more investments that are made outside than inside, and that makes sense because Japan had for a number of decades, for about 30 years, a trade surplus. That trade surplus meant that Japan was basically investing abroad. That was that their savings were greater than domestic investment. So if savings are greater, that capital has to go somewhere. It goes outside. That's because that's what it does. That's the identity. That's what the identity. The capital goes outside. You have a trade surplus, and so the country was a net buyer of assets, and then net capital flows. The capital transfer, or the current transfers from the rest of the world were 2.5 trillion yen, and to the rest of the world were 3.2 trillion yen. So this suggests still some capital transfers, some investment is still being made internationally. So the total, when you take all of that, this plus this minus that's from, so that's a plus, to, that's a minus, from, that's a plus, to, that's a minus. That actually adds up to positive current account. So the current account is positive for Japan in 2013 and 2014. So again, even though the net exports are quite negative, 15 trillion yen, here 28.7 trillion yen was the current account payments. 9 trillion yen to the rest of the world, but still quite a large difference. And that's that. So past investment, that's a lot of investment that's coming in, and because of that past investment, Japan was the current account was still positive. So in spite of that means that still net capital flow is going. There's a net. Japan is a net is a net lender to the world. And so that's so the capital account is the third one. It takes into consideration the change in foreign ownership of domestic assets and the change in domestic ownership of foreign assets. So these are assets that are the change in assets that are held by foreign entities in Japan and by Japanese entities abroad, and that's also an identity. That's the change. This DAF is the change in foreign ownership of domestic assets, and FAD represents the change in domestic ownership of foreign assets. So what that says is that's that these are pretty low. It's like billion yen. So the change is not very very big. There's more foreign ownership of domestic assets and more domestic ownership of foreign assets. So that means capital outflow. So the net, this minus this, means there's a bit of capital outflow. But it's not a lot. It's only 700 billion yen. That for an economy as big as Japan, the capital account is not very important. The capital account is typically more important for you'll see for like third world countries and for underdeveloped countries that are getting a lot of foreign investment. These are typically not very important for advanced industrial economies. So you can see that number is not very big, and it doesn't really change. That's for 2013, 2014. Again, not a very big number. So the total, these totals are quite small, and so the overall that gives the full picture of Japan's interaction with the rest of the world. That's the balance of payments. That's at the end, balance of payments, the sum of the current account and the capital account. That's that identity. And the total, the balance of payments, that Japan was a net lender to the rest of the world of 2.49 trillion yen. In 2013, 2014, 2.45 trillion yen. So a net lend, that means net capital outflow from Japan to the rest of the world. So that says that Japan its balance of payments are slightly positive. They still are. I would expect in future that this will go negative. This will become negative because the number of households that are retiring, the population will continue to age, and so the amount of savings is going to go down. At some point, this is going to be negative. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's a problem. That doesn't mean it's necessarily a problem. It's just that that's what it is. It will have a lot to do. It has a lot to do with the way of the structure of the society, the demographic structure of the society. Lots of people retiring, lots of aged people that are spending and not saving, so that figure should go negative. At one time this was quite positive. It was very positive. Now it's close to zero, but it's still slightly positive. So, as I say, net capital outflow is a result of its trade deficit, its current account outflow, and its current transfer outflow, but these capital outflows were offset by large income payment inflows. So that's the picture of Japan's relationship with the rest of the world. And let me just, let me show you, and I'm going to want you to get familiar with this. Let's see if I can. This is where you find these. This is table 1.1. So and the tables in each country have the same name. So it's always called, this is table 1.1, this is gross domestic product by expenditures at current prices. So that's what's called nominal. This is nominal GDP. Okay, so the nominal GDP, where we get the net exports, is exports of goods and services, less imports of goods and services. So that's here, export, this is by years, is 2014. You can see, so you're going to take exports here, imports here. So this minus that, this figure minus that figure is net exports. So that's where that comes from. That's where the net exports. What you'll see, there's all of these different figures. The household, this is final consumption, broken up into household final consumption, nonprofits, government consumption. So this says how much final consumption by the government. Gross capital formation, that's investment. That's investment, and that's both by fixed capital formation and changes in inventory. And then we have exports and imports. So those are the various components. And I've shown you, if you look at the equation, that equation, the y equals, and all those are the various components. They're just right there. That's where I've gotten these numbers, just to taking it off of that and putting that into the GDP identity. So that's where that comes from. We also have, the next table is gross domestic product by expenditures at constant prices. I haven't talked about this yet. We'll talk more about this later. What this does is it takes into account the change in prices. So the change in price, because prices may change from year to year. So a yen in 2014, the value of 100 yen in 2014 is different from 100 yen in 2013. Different from 100 yen in 2008. They're not the same thing because prices change. If prices change, then what you have to do is you have to understand how prices have changed in order to compare between years. So what that does is, it's what we say in English is apples to apples, an apples to apples comparison, so that you can actually compare. Where here, at constant prices, I can compare these. This means something. This 412 trillion in 2014, 387 trillion in 2008. This is a real increase. This means in real terms, there's been an increase because we've adjusted for the change in prices. This change here, it's not real because it's at the prices in that given particular year. Okay, so that's we'll talk more about that. I just want you to be aware of that now. And then we're going to go and talk about, this is the 1.3. 1.3. This is the relations among product, investment, savings, and net lending. This is the relationship. This talks about the relationship with the rest of the world. And so here's where I get the figures. This was the net. I got net figures here. It's the sum. This figure, because this is up to date. Some of that is these. Some you'll find when you look at that. Sometimes there's things missing. So here I have. This is the sum of compensation of employee and property income to and from and to the rest of the world net. That's that net payment, and that's here. So those are the figures. How'd that happen? Okay. Let me get that. Okay. So that's that. Let me just show that figure. We go back. There's the net here, this figure, the 28,693. That comes right there. That's payments to, that's payments from the rest of the world and payments to the rest of the world. So from and to, and that's the net. But I've broken those out so it's clear, so we can see the detail of that. So that's where that number comes from. Then the current transfers from the rest of the world and to the rest of the world. That's the current transfers. That's this line. So you can see these are different pieces in the flow. And what you do is you're taking these different pieces that talk about from these tables. I'm taking these pieces that tell us the relationship of Japan with the rest of the world. So here we're talking about the current transfers to the rest of the world and from the rest of the world. So that's a negative, and that's gross savings. And then let's see. How do we do that? I think. Okay. How am I getting? Okay, now. And then here's the capital transfers. That's still table 1.3. The capital transfers from the rest of the world to the rest of the world. And then here's the net lending and borrowing. That's the balance of payment number right there. So that number, you can see over the years how that's generally fallen. Remember I was telling you about because of the aging society. That's where all of those numbers come from. And what I'll want you to do, one of the things that you will be doing, I'll want you to do is get familiar. It's a little bit intimidating, I can understand that. But we'll have some exercises so you can go get this data, you can see exactly where to get it, to begin to understand what it says and understand how to interpret it. So you can interpret it and then understand something about how the world interacts and how countries interact with each other financially. Now, so you'll get some exercise on that. Now, what we're going to talk about now is we're going to go over just some of the big picture, some of the big pictures here, and we're going to talk first about GDP per capita. So overall GDP. I haven't talked about GDP yet per capita. I've wanted you to you've seen all of those you've seen all the maps. You've done some exercises about that. So that gives you some feeling for how wealth is the wealth of natural resources, creating wealth through manufacturing and creating services, trade. How and why countries trade, I think you have some idea of that. Now we're going to put the big picture, and as I say, I want you to understand all that, so then when we look at GDP per capita, it starts, these maps will now start to make sense. You'll start now connecting the certain things that happen in the world, we'll see which countries are rich, which countries are poor, and you'll begin to get a sense. Well, and some of you have noticed in your exercise, I've seen some of the comments where people are saying, noticing how some countries that in general, you'll see countries that sell a lot of natural resources may not be very wealthy. But there are exceptions. There are exceptions. There are exceptions. Countries that are primarily sellers of natural resources can still be, but many of them are not. Countries that manufacture a lot tend to have higher incomes. And now we're going to start putting that picture together. This just talks about some background information. Typically, you use the U.S. dollar. These are U.S. dollar terms. So one of the things when you look, you have to use some type of measurement if you compare across countries, and it's U.S. dollars. The problem with using with U.S. dollars is that fluctuations in the value of the dollar compared with other countries can make there's a lot of fluctuation, and the fluctuation may not actually reflect a change in wealth, so you have to be careful about that. And we'll see later in the semester, we'll talk about how to deal with that problem. But for right now, this is just in dollars. I'm taking those figures. I've taken this from the World Bank. I've used that for the year 2012 with a few exceptions that are noted here. The relative GDP were calculated against the global GDP average. So that's where these maps come from. And we'll start out with Africa. And Africa, and you can see that it's red is below average GDP. These are some of the poorest countries in the world. The African countries, particularly a lot of the Central African countries, Democratic Republic of the Congo, staggeringly corrupt country, incredible problems. You're talking about the Central African Republic. Here's Burundi there. There's Malawi there. Ethiopia there. Eritrea, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea-Bissau. These are a lot of these countries. These really dark red. Some of the poorest countries in the world. We can see some of it a little bit brighter. Nigeria is Africa's biggest economy in terms of total output. With big population, it's one of the world's most populous countries, but a little bit brighter. Here's Ghana, a little bit brighter. The Southern African countries are a little bit. That's South Africa. That's one of the highest incomes. That's the most important manufacturing country, as you've mentioned. Manufacturing. That's that relationship there. You have manufacturing. But then we have these ones above average. We have Gabon, which is slightly above average, and how I mentioned there the situation of a country with low population and lots of natural resources. So that's at least on average relatively wealthy. And then here, one of the most curious countries in the world, that's Equatorial Guinea. Right there, Equatorial Guinea, the darker. That is somewhere about there. That's well above, pretty reasonably above world average. But it's actually and yet it's the average person, or the most of the people are incredibly poor. So this is a country that everybody would be reasonably wealthy if it was evenly distributed, but it's not. But this is because it's a very small country, it's a very small population, it's less than 1 million people, and it has lots of oil. There's a lot of oil right there. It's quite overall per capita, it comes out quite wealthy. That's Libya. Libya, again, a very small country in terms of population, big country in terms of area, small country in terms of population, it has a lot of oil. This was reflected, did I say, let's see if no, Syria was 2007. That country, that was 2012. After that, the country has basically fallen apart. There's a lot there's a civil war going on. It's probably not that level now. But in 2012, it was still a little bit above the world average. But again, it's because a lot of natural resources and few people in that country. Algeria has natural resources. It's a larger population, a fair amount of natural resources, a fair amount of trade with Europe, and fairly close relationship with France in particular. So there's a lot of French investment, there, and a lot of trade. So Algeria is a little bit wealthier than some other countries in Africa. We've talked about that Zambia, a little bit higher. There's some manufacturing there. We've talked a little bit about that. If you look at some of those patterns, you'll see. What I'll want you to do is go back, if you're interested in a continent, go back and compare the maps, the resources, and you'll start seeing the patterns as to what produces what kind of outcome. Here's Europe. Per capita, some of the wealthiest countries in the world. Scandinavian countries are very wealthy. Sweden has a lot of manufacturing, very powerful manufacturing country, even though it's a small country. It's actually quite dynamic country. Norway has immense natural resources, lots and lots of oil, relatively small population. There's Denmark, a very wealthy country, less natural resources, but a fair bit of a lot of trade, manufactured products, particularly food processing is an important industry in that country. It's Switzerland, very wealthy country. It's Austria. These kind of populations are larger, so these are larger populations, more diverse, so they tend to be. The average income is a little bit lower. France and Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, quite wealthy. This is something relatively more recent. That Ireland is. This is Ireland and the UK. Ireland a little bit higher per capita income. You can see all of it's pretty much above the world average. But then you get to these southern European countries. Italy a little bit lower, not much lower, but then Spain definitely lower. Spain has suffered quite severely from the financial crisis in 2008. Portugal has always been a poor country. Greece, of course, if you're familiar with the problems there. But then you're these Eastern European countries. Many of these countries were part of the Soviet bloc. They were communist countries that now many of them are now part of the West. Their incomes are lagging, but they've improved. This is the Czech Republic. They're doing quite well. They've made quite a impressive transformation. Slovakia, again above average. There's Poland. That's been a big improvement over the last several decades. Here's Lithuania. Here's Estonia, Latvia, all the Baltic states. These countries have benefited tremendously from EU membership. Then you have the former Yugoslavia here. These are the Baltic states. Slovenia, that was the richest of the former Yugoslavian parts of the former Yugoslavia. It was always more European. Croatia, a little bit more European. Then this was the core of the Baltic, there's Bosnia and Herzegovina. You've had Serbia there. That's Serbia. These are below average. They're catching up, but there's still a lot of problems. a lot of problems there. These countries were more part of the Soviet bloc. They were more connected to the former Soviet Union, Romania, Bulgaria. These were part of the old Soviet Union. That's Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova. That's part of Ukraine. That's now part of Russia. So Russia is a little bit higher just because of its wealth in natural resources. It comes out a little bit above average. Interestingly, Turkey is about the global average. Turkey is a country that's kind of part of Europe and part of the Middle East. But you'll see Turkey is much wealthier than most of many of these nearby Arab countries. That's Cyprus. That's actually part of the EU. At least southern Cyprus. That's a member of the EU and in the Eurozone. It's in the Eurozone. So that's Europe. There's the Middle East, and we see the contrast. Here, this is the Persian Gulf. These are some of the countries in the world in terms of per capita income. Kuwait and Qatar are basically some of the highest per capita incomes in the world. This is right at the top. That's just an incredible oil wealth, small population, an incredible amount of natural resources, and now increasingly financial. There are financial powerhouses. A lot of financial industries are located there. This is the United Arab Emirates, again quite wealthy, both from natural resources and from the location of the financial industry. Both Qatar and the United Arab Emirates both have a lot. That's Dubai, Doha here, and Dubai there. Then there's Saudi Arabia. It's a little bit lower because it's a big population. I think it's 60 million. It's a very rapidly growing country in terms of population. On average, reasonably wealthy, certainly above the global average, but a fairly large country. Oman here, a little bit above the global average. And then you have the countries that don't have a lot of natural resources in the Middle East. They're much poorer. That is Yemen. Yemen, terrible civil war going on there. That's also, it's kind of a proxy conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia that are arming Iran on one side and Saudi Arabia on the other. So that's part of geopolitical. You've got these two countries that are in conflict. They're both fighting what we call a proxy war in Syria. Both sides you have the government here. Iran is arming certain sides. Saudi Arabia is on other, basically fighting it's basically fighting war. These two countries are kind of fighting wars with each other through other countries because they're both really aiming for power in the Middle East. Now you'll see Iran is below world average, and it's because of the sanctions, and it's been kept outside of the international economy. The West views Iran as a troublemaker in the world. So that's certainly a part of that, and the President of the United States was just there and making clear that he wants Iran to be suppressed, and he wants to support Saudi Arabia. The previous American president was basically the opposite, was basically more support for Iran and less for Saudi Arabia. So that's kind of reversed. So that's kind of the big geopolitical picture. But what you see here is a lot of it is it's the natural resources. Relatively little natural resources in Jordan, below average. Syria, of course, affected by the civil war, and a lot less natural and not much natural resources there. Lebanon is a little bit better off. It's kind of the banking center. It's an important banking center in the Middle East. It's traditionally been the center of finance of the Middle East for many decades. So that explains that. That's Egypt. Egypt is the biggest Arab country in terms of population. It's considered a very important country, but quite poor. It's a relatively poor country, not much natural resources. And then there's Israel. Israel right there. Israel, and you can see the Israel well above world average. It's because it's basically a manufacturing, very powerful manufacturing country, and a very industrious population that does a lot of manufacturing. Now there's more natural resources. They found natural gas. Stands out in contrast with the surrounding area. So that's the basic picture of the Middle East. A lot of it is driven by resources in terms of Israel manufacturing. Otherwise, natural resources are a big explanation there. Asia per capita. This is the most rapidly developing part of the world. What's interesting, in my lifetime, in fact in my adult lifetime, China has gone from one of the poorest countries in the world to, it's a little bit below average. It's still a little bit below average, but rapidly catching up. This is a dramatic change, and it's had a dramatic impact on the entire world. 1.3 billion people whose incomes have dramatically increased. So it's still below average. It's still below average, but it's of course had it's a significant change. And in the big picture, Asia is still relatively poor, and you can see how Japan, which is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, right near the top. Korea, not quite as much, but still well above average, and certainly how these two countries stand out. And as we've seen, these are both countries extremely poor in natural resources, and yet able basically to import natural resources and turn them into valuable products, creating value and wealth, and importing natural resources and exporting manufactured products to the world. So that's the source of the wealth of these two countries. And one of the things there, it shows that natural resource just because a country is poor in natural resources doesn't mean it can't get wealthy. And these are just some of the best examples in the world of that. There's Brunei, that little spot there. Brunei is a very small country. It's less than 500,000. It has lots of natural gas, and much of that is exported to Japan. That's resource based. That's Malaysia. Malaysia is a mixture of manufacturing. It's a mixture of manufacturing and natural resources. It's a bit of oil, but a fair amount of manufacturing in Malaysia. So Malaysia is just about global average, but on Asian terms, a relatively wealthy country. You'll see Thailand. Thailand is kind of China. Thailand has become a reasonably wealthy country. I've spent a fair bit of time in Thailand, so I know the country, especially in Bangkok. I know Bangkok reasonably well, and you can see it's not a rich country, but you can go to Bangkok and certainly feel that it's there's certainly wealth. There's certainly disparities in income, but a fair amount of wealth there. India, though, is still relatively poor. India is coming up, but it has a ways to go. I'll talk about the India and a couple of things towards the end of the semester. So you can start thinking about how to, in terms of your presentation, I'm going to make lectures that will be something about what I want to see. Not that I want to see you do exactly the same thing, but some of the ideas I'm going to be talking about in lectures about the Chinese and Indian economies. At any rate, India, you'll see, still is a long way to go. It's a long way to go. It's making a lot of progress. There's a lot of change going on. It's not coming as fast as China, but you are seeing some real changes. And that's, again, it's 1.3 billion people, about the same population as China. That is going to have a significant impact on the global economy in the next 25 years, the growth of India. Bangladesh, though, relatively poor. Nepal, a relatively poor country. Pakistan, actually not much different than India. The interesting thing is that these two countries really, there's a perception of India being much wealthier, but this is the reality, is there's not much difference. There's Afghanistan, one of the poorest countries in the world. Cambodia, quite poor. Laos, quite poor. Vietnam has come up, but it's still not a wealthy country. And not quite, in Indonesia, it's below average, but a little bit above, in India. It is a country that there are positive changes. You are seeing positive changes in this country, so it's beginning to come up. That's the Philippines. The Philippines is kind of, it's kind of spun around, and it kind of spins in circles. Everybody expects something to happen there, and nothing much ever really happens in that country. So that's the kind of sense of overall of Asia. Mongolia, not as wealthy as China, but wealthier than some of the Asian countries. You can see it's a little bit lighter red. That's natural resources. There's lots of natural resources, a very small population in that. There's Russia, Kazakhstan, natural resources, lots of natural resources, and also closely tied in with Russia. It's very integrated with the Russian economy. It's part of the former Soviet Union. Then you got some very poor. These Central Asian countries are quite poor. That's Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, relatively poor. That's Turkmenistan, right there. A little bit, I think that's oil wealth in that country. But many of those countries are relatively poor. Not surprising, we've talked a lot about Australia. Great natural resources, small population. That's the kind of formula for a country with natural resources. You see it in Gabon, above average income, small population, lots of natural resources. Yet the same is true in Equatorial Guinea. Here's the picture in Australia. Lots and lots of natural resources that are sold. Not a lot of manufactured products. Not much manufactured, very little manufactured exports. It's just far from global markets. There's not a lot of reason for the country to be an exporting powerhouse. That's New Zealand, a little bit lower income than Australia, still relatively high, but not quite as high. Australia, one of the richest countries in the world. Again, it's more natural resources. Natural resources, agriculture there. Both of them have a lot of agriculture as well, kind of natural resource-based economies. North America, of course, these are the United States, one of the great economic powers in the world. The world's largest, now second largest economy after China in terms of total GDP, but an economic powerhouse. Canada, great natural resources. This is natural resource, very similar to Australia, as we've seen. Go back on the maps, the same thing over and over again. Lots of natural resources, lots of natural resource export. Fair bit of manufacturing that trade with the United States. That's almost all trade with the United States in terms of manufacturing. There's Mexico. Mexico's come up a lot. Mexico has benefited tremendously from the North America Free Trade Agreement. That's a little bit below the average, but it's you'll see the contrast with many of these other Central American countries, much darker red. That's the benefit that Mexico has received, both from lots of manufacturing, a lot of investment in manufacturing, both in the United States, Canada, Japan's invested a lot. There's a lot of investment that Japan has made in manufacturing in Mexico, and in part for the U.S. market. Automobile manufacturing is a very important part of that. And also, there's a relatively new free trade agreement between Japan and Mexico that has resulted in an increase in trade and an increase in investment between the two countries, particularly by Japanese companies in Mexico. Central America, quite poor, very, very poor countries. These are societies that are poor. They have a lot. There's a lot of political instability. There's relatively violent in many of these countries. This is Guatemala, Honduras. That's Nicaragua. That's El Salvador. Those are countries that have had a lot of conflict over the last decades. And it's been a source of a lot of illegal immigration to the United States. I did want to mention also both illegal and legal immigration from Mexico. Lots of money gets sent back to Mexico, so that's had an impact as well in raising the standard of living there. So, but here a lot of problems. These are some relatively poor countries, but then we have two countries here that for Costa Rica, a stable country. It's a real exception in this part of the world. It's stable. It actually doesn't have a standing army. It's a relatively prosperous country. Panama has a lot of is kind of an investment center. A fair bit of dark money, as we'll see. A fair bit of shall we say dark money, dark shady money is in that country. But it is a financial center for Central America. Then here's the Caribbean. That's Cuba. Of course, has had an embargo with the United States, trade embargo, so that's been a problem. That's Haiti, the dark red, one of the poorest countries in the world. Lots of problems. There's Dominican Republic, a little bit better off. Some natural resources in the Dominican Republic. Also a fair bit of a fairly close relationship with the United States. Jamaica, that's Jamaica. There's Bahamas, is relatively wealthy. You can see the color there. It's a little bit brighter. It's a blue above the world average. It was a former British colony that's kind of retained. It's an important financial center. Literally offshore banking. South America, relatively prosperous actually in general. Brazil, a little bit above the world average. Brazil has become a relatively prosperous country. It's had a lot of problems in the last decade though. It's going through enormous political problems. And part of it is that this is a country that's maturing. I think what's going on here is that the society it's been historically a very corrupt country, and people are the average citizen is reacting to the level of the traditional corruption, and I think you're seeing some changes. The last president was impeached from office on corruption charges. That was about a year ago. The current president is being charged with corruption, and he might be gone. He replaced her, and she was thrown out for corruption, and he might be thrown out for corruption as well. This is a country that's going through, but it's positive changes. I think it's positive changes. This is an interesting country. I had a student analyze this country in my class last year, and she certainly learned a lot from analyzing that country. It's the biggest country in South America. A fascinating country. Argentina, it's above average. It's had a lot of problems, but this is resource rich, especially agriculture. Very rich country agriculturally. Uruguay is a relatively small country. These have a lot of European immigrants. So both of these countries are primarily actually more European immigrants, and actually Chile also. These are dominated by descendants of Europeans in these three southern countries. These countries, in particular, from Germany and Italy, actually Germany and Italy, in Argentina and Uruguay, big German and immigrant and Italian immigrant populations in these two countries. That's not as well known. I think Chile is more Spain. Was more immigration from Spain. Then you have these poor countries. Paraguay has traditionally been it's an inland country. It's cut off. It's quite isolated country. It's been economically and it's a relatively isolated country. It's had a lot of political problems. It's been a country that's been dominated. It's been a fairly dictatorial, a lot of repressive governments historically. So it's a bit behind in that way. Bolivia is a country that I think has a majority of native the people that immigrated from Asia 15,000 in the last 10 to 15,000 years. So these are people that have lived in this part of the world for many years. That is a fair bit of resources, but it's still quite a poor country. It's a very high mountainous country with lots of natural resources. Things are changing. Things are changing there, but it's there's a bit of conflict. So there's still ways to go. Chile is a fascinating country. We've talked about the natural resources, great, rich in natural resources. And this is certainly a country that's benefited because of natural resources, the way that Canada and Australia, not quite as wealthy, but one of the better off countries. Peru has had a fair bit of political. It's reasonably wealthy in terms of resources, but politically, it's had a mixed picture over the decades. Ecuador is actually poorer than you would expect. This has a fair bit of oil. I don't know a lot about this country. It's curious. It's a country that hasn't had a lot of conflict, and yet it's relatively poor. That's an interesting one to anybody's interested in investigating why. That's one that for me I don't quite understand what the picture is. This is Colombia. Colombia should be a relatively wealthy country. It's had a lot of problems with civil war, a kind of civil war. It's had rebels that have been fighting the government. That's kind of ending now. The country is beginning to become more peaceful. It's also been the source of a lot of drugs, of the drug trade for North America. Colombia has unfortunately been important, especially cocaine. It's been an important source of that, and that's kind of fueled these conflicts. So the conflicts have kind of had a negative impact. That's Venezuela. Venezuela, it's above average. It's relatively wealthy, but this is 2012. Things have gone down dramatically. That's a country that's had dramatic mismanagement. The government there is dramatic mismanagement of the country. I don't think there's any. It's a great example. Policies can create poverty. I could spend a lot of time talking about it. There's been a lot of economic injustice, certainly, on the one hand, and yet when socialists came to power to change that, in the end, the change that they created was something that ended up being quite negative. So it's an interesting picture of a country of Latin America, a very traditional Latin American country, but incredible natural resources. The world's has the more proven reserves of petroleum than any other country in the world. So this is a country great natural resources. Then this is Guyana. This was an English colony. It's relatively poor. That's Suriname. That was a French, Dutch. That was a Dutch colony. That's French Guyana. There's not a lot of data. That's typically is lacking data. So you'll see that. Now I'm going to talk about the balance of payments. So that's the overall picture of GDP globally. And also, I've noticed, it looks like people are watching these. You're going back and viewing the videos. I appreciate that. And I think there's a lot of information that I'm giving you here. So I would urge you to continue watch. It looks like most of you, if not all of you, looked at the last video. I would go listen to this lecture again, because there is a lot of information about the world. It's more than, and I think it's good not to take notes, just to try to pay attention and then go back and look at it again. Now I've talked about GDP. Now I'm going to talk about balance of payments, and now I want to see what the relationship is. There a relationship between balance of payments and GDP? That's one of the things we want to see. We want to see is there a relationship? Capital flows, if capital is flowing in or out of a country, if the net exports, current account, the structure of that, if that matters towards overall wealth. What we're going to focus on is that big picture, the bottom line of balance of payments. So we're going to look at that globally. And as I say, one of the things is that this is the earlier discussion. I said a positive balance of payment figure represents a net inflow of capital, while a negative balance of payment figure represents a net outflow of capital from a country. A positive balance of payments is essentially a net purchaser of foreign assets. You're acquiring more assets, which can be a positive. In other words, it's a net investment in the rest of the world. You're making a country with a positive balance of payments is a net investor in the rest of the world. So if a country is acquiring more assets outside of the country, that can be a positive thing, and particularly for a relatively developed country. We've seen that with Japan. Japan has made a lot of investments outside of Japan, and is having a positive impact because there's a lot of investment or investment earned is able to come into the country. And on the other hand, a negative means you're a net seller of domestic assets to the rest of the world. Now, one of the things is that it's very easy for people to think that positive is good and negative is bad. Positive means, okay, you're acquiring more assets. Negative means you're a net seller. A negative balance of payments means that the country is selling assets overall to foreigners. That's what that means. It's a country is selling assets to foreigners. That, again, that may or may not be a good thing. And the way to think about that is that, for example, if the negative balance payments represents an inflow of foreign direct investment, and we'll talk more about FDI, foreign direct investment, later in the semester, that's intended for development of that nation's infrastructure, then the rest of the world is seeing investment opportunities. They're seeing that a country is developing. They're seeing that it's worth investing in that country, and that can help that country develop. And a great example of that was the development of the United States, which had large negative balance of payment flows in the 19th century. But that was because it was a growing country. The economy was growing. It had tremendous need for investment capital, and that came particularly from Great Britain. So Great Britain, its former colony, British investors invested enormous amounts of money in infrastructure in the United States. For example, to develop the railroad, to develop the telegraph, telecommunications infrastructure in the United States in the 19th century. So the United States ran a negative balance of payments in the 19th century, but for a very positive reason. But now, an inflow, if you have a negative balance of payments for a developing nation, it could also mean that it's just importing capital in order and this happens in many African countries, the balance of payments is negative because the elite are buying foreign goods for consumption, and it's not so that the average person it can make the average person more wealthy. It's basically an elite that's just consuming. So that happens as well. So you have to you have to look. It's case by case. You have to look case by case. You have to understand what all of those mean. Each element, what that means, the net exports, current account, capital account, to understand what those, the overall balance of payments, investment flows, to understand what all of those mean in the context of each country, as to whether it's a manufacturer, resource base, where it is in its development, at what stage of development it's at. All of those help paint the picture of where that country is and whether those things are positive or negative, whether the country is well managed or not, whether it has good governance, whether it has a good government that basically is interested in the average person becoming more wealthy, or whether it's a government that exploits its citizens. Those are very important things to consider and keep in mind. So you have to keep that in mind. So we will keep that in mind, and I'll discuss the general picture of balance of payments in that context. I've talked about Japan's balance of payments. That was a few pages previous. But we'll show as a share of GDP across countries for the 2010-2014 period. And I used data from the World Bank to make these tables. And so I averaged the balance of payment percentage across those figures. Because 1 year, there can be a lot of ups and downs. But if you take a few years, you start getting kind of an average picture over time. Most of that was for 2010, 2014. There are a few exceptions that are listed here. So that's as a share of GDP. So balance of payments as a share of GDP. Some of this, the blue is positive, red is negative. And again, some of these pictures, and you can see for Africa, we have some countries that are missing data. Chad, South Sudan, Central African Republic, for example. There's Zimbabwe that's missing data. Some of that, it's a lot of different pictures, different colors, different intensity, a lot of different things going on in Africa. And the point here is that Africa is not one. A lot of people think of Africa and they think, oh, okay, it's a economic disaster, war, all of these different things. Very simplistic picture. It's very complicated picture. And you see different countries and different situations. Gabon, for example, very high, and that's because of rich resources. So that's because the country's rich in resources. It's exporting a lot of oil relative to the size of the economy. So it's becoming relatively wealthy, reasonably wealthy by African standards as a result of that. Mozambique, that might not be. That's very negative balance of payments. And Malawi, a negative balance of payments. But they're very poor countries. These are some of the poorest countries in the world. This is probably not a positive. It's probably not a positive for these countries. They're not becoming wealthy because of that. Zambia is exporting. It has a fair amount of hydroelectric power. Chinese investment is helping it to become a net. It's exporting. This is probably a positive. That's Angola. Angola, it's a little bit mixed. That's because of oil wealth. It's a net exporter, so its balance payments is positive. But there's a lot of problems. That's not necessarily a positive. Nigeria is an exporter of petroleum. It's a major exporter, one of the world's significant petroleum producers. So that's producing a relatively wealth. Here's Ivory Coast, is cocoa. It's the world's biggest producer of cocoa. But it's had a lot of problems that may or may not be positive. Ghana is slightly negative, but it's getting investment. This is a country that's growing because of investment. The same thing with Rwanda, the little country there. That negative is probably a good thing. It's getting a lot of investment capital. It's growing quite rapidly. Mauritania, I think this might be a more complicated picture in this country. That's quite negative. I'd need to look at that. That's Niger. Niger, that's probably not very positive. It's a poor country. It's one of the lowest incomes in the world. This is one of those countries that have a lot of agricultural wealth, potential agricultural wealth, in terms of arable land per person, but it doesn't trade very much. Now, if it's getting foreign investment in order to develop its agriculture, that could be a positive for the country. You'd have to look into that and see if that's the situation. So you can see it's kind of case by case. You have to go around. That's the oil, but we know that country is going through a lot of problems. Tunisia is experiencing some political instability. That may not be positive. As I say, it's a mixed picture. You really have to go to each individual country in order to clearly understand whether or not that is a positive or negative. If you're interested in Africa, I would really urge, if you have any interest in it, I would urge you to think about picking one of these countries and looking at it as a very interesting research project for the semester. I had a student that did Senegal. Senegal is actually very, this country right here, Senegal, is a very attractive. It's growing a lot. It's getting a lot of investment. There's a lot of good things happening in that country. So that negative is probably a positive. This is the Gambia. It recently had threw out its long-term president. It was done through election. He didn't want to leave. He was forced out by both from Senegal and European governments helped to drive him out of power. He stole a lot of money when he left. So, but that's not. That may or may not, it's probably not necessarily positive. You'd have to look exactly what the picture there. As I say again, it's very complicated. Djibouti is getting a lot of foreign investment. That's that little country. It's actually a very important country, believe it or not. It's probably the most important country in the world that you probably have never heard of is Djibouti. How many people have heard of Djibouti? Exactly. That is, if you look at its location, it's right at the entrance to the Red Sea. This is actually one of the world's very important shipping lane, right through here, and that's right there at the entrance. You've got an unstable country that's Yemen, civil wars there. You've got an unstable country there. There's been a lot of piracy from this country. Eritrea is not a terribly stable country. So there's a lot of instability. Ethiopia, a little bit more so. And this is probably a positive picture. The country's growing quite rapidly, so there's probably a lot of investment. That's probably positive. that it's getting inflow of investment. Djibouti is actually is a very strategic location. The U.S. and France have major naval bases there, huge naval bases, and very importantly, and this is the China is going to have a naval base, is establishing a naval base here. So this is part of China's investment in Africa, and I would say certainly in some of this you'll want to look at the effect that Chinese investment is having on why these are red, and a lot of this is probably quite positive for this region. But that's China is. And as I lectured in the class last year. Actually, one of the ways that you may have that will help to establish to keep the world a peaceful place is you have the United States and China are going to have military facilities right next to each other in a small country in a strategic location. And one of the things that that's going to do, it means that there's going to be a lot of communication. It's one of the ways that the militaries of these two countries, these two very powerful countries, are actually going to be in that country because of the facilities that they will have in that country are probably going. If there's any potential problems, there's probably going to be contact between the U.S. and China that's going to come in part because of the military located there. So it's a very interesting picture. And I say, if you're, as I say, very few people have heard of this country. I actually met somebody once from Djibouti. It's Black Africa. It's your East African. If you know East Africans, like Ethiopians and Somalians, they have dark skin, but very different. Their features are very different from West African. But at any rate, that is you'll want to look into that country. It's fascinating, very interesting what's going on there in that country. It's strategically very important country. Europe. The balance of payments a lot of it. Some of this is resource driven or manufacturing driven. Resource driven. There, that's the resource wealth. Great manufacturer. Germany, a great manufacturing nation like Japan. In fact, I think. Still, even though it only has about 80 million people, it's one of the world's great manufacturing countries. This is an enormously powerful country. That's from the trade in banking, but also pharmaceuticals. So this is actually quite a powerful economic country, even though it's tiny. It's only about 6 million people. But very powerful both in terms of banking and also pharmaceuticals. So very, very powerful country. Let's see, are we getting towards the end? Oh, we're just about at the end of the class. Well, that's pretty much where I think I'm going to stop there. Let's see, what's going on? Oh, there we go. Let's see. The next thing I'm going to talk about, and we'll go into that next time. I'm going to send this to you. I want you to go over this. I'm going to talk about the real interest rates. The real interest rates have a lot to do with also to do with the attractiveness of a country. And the balance of payments, real interest rates, actually tells us a lot about the country's relationship with the rest of the world. When real interest rates are high, it says that there's risk. It either says there's a lot of risk, or the country is attracting a lot of inflow, and they want to attract capital. But again, case by case. But I want you to please go over these maps before the next class. I'll send this to you. I think we're falling a little bit behind. I think that's all I wanted to get to. That's as far as I wanted to get. So it's okay. It's going a little bit slower, but that's okay. I would rather cover this material in a way that that you understand it than go through all the material. So thank you on that. I'll go through the two assignments. I'll get that back to you before the next class. So what I've seen so far looks quite good. People are doing some good work, some good thinking about this stuff. I think it looks like I've got a good class of students here, so I appreciate your what I've seen so far. I look forward to seeing you, the work that you've done this week, and to seeing you in class next week. Thanks.